So thank you all for listening to our banter prior to the start of the session. I am really hoping that we can keep this as interactive as possible. So I'm going to try and sort of have my eye on the chat. So thank you to everyone that's come, that's participating. And I just want to share, this is a new session for me today. And it's come because I've been working with a lot of organizations recently who are what I would call sort of SharePoint first organizations. You know, they've been working with SharePoint for a really long time. And so they've got team collaboration spaces in SharePoint. Shameless plug, this is a screenshot from Goodnight Subsites. If you haven't read it yet, it's going to be a definite bestseller, a little parable that Mark Cashman and I wrote about what we hope are the death of subsites. And so, you know, organizations that have been sort of SharePoint first for a really long time had some massive changes happen in 2020 when early in the pandemic, many of them, whether they were on-prem or in the cloud, kind of raced to deploy Microsoft Teams so that for the most part, people could do meetings and chat while working from home. And so, yes, I'm talking about SharePoint in a Teams conference. And so in many cases, you know, what happened was the connection between Teams and SharePoint was never really explained. In fact, I have clients where they were told to ignore the Files tab in their Teams, not realizing that simply by creating a team, I do it with hand signals, it's already too late because you've got a SharePoint site. And then without providing their users with training to help make that connection between SharePoint and Teams. And so with this great intention of helping people to work from anywhere to make that possible, I think many organizations did not necessarily enable sort of what I'd call the ideal scenario, especially if their users were already using SharePoint. You know, if you were Teams first, it's actually less confusing. But if you've been using SharePoint and then rapidly deployed Teams, you might have thought you were enabling sort of this work from anywhere scenario and creating a one-stop shop for teamwork with Teams, you know, with chat and meetings and collaboration all in one place. But what typically happened, at least for many of my clients, is this massive confusion. Now people are totally confused about what goes where can I find things, and almost more importantly, where do I put things? If you guys heard this one, do I put it in Teams or do I put it in SharePoint? I hear this all the time. And so we want everyone to have all of the advantages of working in Teams and have one place to go for their teamwork. But if your teams, little t teams, already had a SharePoint site when you launched Microsoft Teams, then we might have some issues. And this is the sort of this classic issue of where do I find my files now? Are they in SharePoint or are they in Teams? I mean, we all know this, or at least I hope all of you know this. No files are stored anywhere in Microsoft 365 except SharePoint. And so, you know, where's my file? It is in SharePoint. And so what I really want to talk about today is how we should be, or if we can now, how we can go back to our teams and help them really understand the SharePoint Teams connection. And what I want to share today is some best practices that you can share with your colleagues, especially if you're responsible for the Teams deployment, to help them make that connection and understand that the knowledge and experience that they have with SharePoint is not necessarily going away, and help them sort of make the transition so that Teams can become the place that they work and go to every day. So I'm going to try and share some of my, you know, tips and tricks. And Carmen, yes, if you're moving from SharePoint on-prem to SharePoint online, I feel your pain. I am now actually working with an organization on taking their intranet from on-prem to the cloud and unpacking a whole lot of things, and I can't blame anyone else because I designed their intranet in 2013, so it's really my fault. All right, so this is probably a lot easier for what I'm calling Teams first organizations, organizations that never had SharePoint and are learning about Microsoft 365 from a Teams lens. So for these users, aligning SharePoint content with Teams is actually a secondary focus. But if you were a SharePoint first organization, you really do need to help your users understand the relationship between Teams and SharePoint. And the first thing I think we need to make sure everyone understands is that we're not really putting files in Teams. Teams files are stored in SharePoint. And you know that, but your users might not, which is why they often ask, should I put my files in Teams or should I put it in SharePoint? And so besides explaining that Oprah is really the queen of Microsoft 365, I often talk about that SharePoint actually lives behind the scenes in the backstage of Teams. And so when so here's how I sort of talk this through. So we've probably completely confused your users when you've launched Teams. And so what we really want to make people understand is the connection between Teams and SharePoint. So when you create a team, of course, you are getting a SharePoint site behind the scenes. You get one channel for free. It's called General. And if you look inside the default document library in SharePoint, again, if you are starting from scratch, there is one subfolder in that SharePoint document library. Now, this is where people start to get freaked out because many consultants have told people for a long, long time, we don't talk about, I'm going to use an Encanto reference. We don't talk about the F word. We don't talk about folders in SharePoint. Well, I think it's time to get over that. First of all, folders do have a place. We haven't killed any kittens because we've used folders. We haven't really harmed anyone. However, nested folders, that is a problem. And by nesting, I don't mean one level. I don't necessarily even mean 2 levels. But when you go 3 levels and below in nesting in SharePoint, you can create a findability challenge and an information discovery challenge. When you're working from the Teams lens, however, you are going to need subfolders. It is going to happen. And so we need to get over this folders are evil model because every Teams channel creates a SharePoint folder. And when I get questions about this, what I usually say is, get over it. It's happening. When you create your second channel, of course, then you are going to get a second subfolder. So each subfolder in each channel in Teams has a corresponding subfolder. My favorite new feature rolling out now is that finally, when you rename a channel, the corresponding folder in SharePoint will also be renamed. This will make it much easier for us to understand the synchronization between SharePoint and Teams because they will look the same. The next thing we, of course, need to explain is this concept of a private channel. And depending on your provisioning model, this can confuse people or not. Because sometimes people don't understand when I should create a private channel, when I need a new team. And I have a slide about that. But the concept, and this is, someone told me they didn't quite understand that this was happening. This was just last week, that when you create a private channel, you are actually getting behind the scenes a completely separate SharePoint site. Again, this is it confuses me too, but the reason we do this is the reason Microsoft does this is to encapsulate the permissions that are appropriate for that private channel. What's important to explain about a private channel is that you have to be in the team first to be in the private channel. And of course, we are soon to get this concept of a shared channel, which of course shouldn't be confused with private channels, because a shared channel is does create another SharePoint site, but it in fact, with a shared channel, you don't have to be a member of the team in order to be part of that shared channel. And what shared channels, I think what most people will use them for is to create a channel with a different organization so that you can stay in context of your team's tenant and still collaborate with the external organization. But you can also use these shared channels to share with a team inside the organization as well, which will give us, again, another way to collaborate on a regular basis with another group of people without necessarily having to create an entirely new team. Although, again, behind the scenes, you are going to absolutely get a private, you will get a private, you will get an additional SharePoint site. Mute my chat. Are you hearing my chat, David? I'm not sure what that, I don't know that it's my chat. All right, so with all of this confusion, I think the answer is now sort of what should we do and how should we explain things? And so I really like, before I go further, I want to do sort of a little terminology check, because today I know we're talking about team collaboration, and this is supported by Microsoft Teams, and from a back-end perspective, obviously, a SharePoint team site. But there are other types of SharePoint sites as well, and I think it's important that we make sure that our users understand, at least in the modern world, what the differences are. And so in Microsoft 365, when you create a team, you are going to get behind the scenes a team site, which is a specific template oriented towards team collaboration. When you're building your intranet, you're going to use a different type of SharePoint site, which is, here's my chat pop-ups. I don't know how you're seeing my chat pop-ups. All right, tell me if you're still seeing them now, because I'm only sharing one screen, I think. Can you confirm that you're, yeah, what are we seeing?
I just can see the presentation.
Okay, the presentation, okay. All right, thanks. Okay, all right, so when we're making an intranet, we're using a communications site, and that is a different site template. What's primarily the difference between a communication site and a team site is the permission model. Communication sites use classic SharePoint groups. Team sites and Microsoft Teams are using Microsoft 365 groups for permissioning. So again, if you're a SharePoint first organization, communication sites use the SharePoint permission model that you actually are very used to. Modern team sites use Microsoft 365 groups. And then the third type of site we're going to use in our environment, although people think this is a type of site, it actually isn't, is a hub. And a hub is actually not a type of site. It's a designation that you add to either a team site or a communication site to create families of sites, effectively to replicate a lot of the capability we got with subsites, but inside the modern flat architecture. And so most hubs are going to be communication sites, but they can be team sites as well. So I think there's really, when you're making this sort of team to SharePoint journey, you could start from 3 different places. And unfortunately, the experience might be a little bit different. And I'll talk a little bit about each one. You could be on-prem in your classic site model. You could be in the cloud using classic team sites, or you could be in the cloud using modern team sites using Microsoft 365 groups. And no matter where you're starting, adding a team is going to change the experience for your users. It's going to be disruptive. It's going to effectively move people's cheese. So no matter where you started, if you were that SharePoint first organization, you're going to need to think about sort of what is happening to our new teams. When you effectively Teamify an existing site, Teams is going to disrupt the folder structure that you're using inside the shared documents library, because it's going to automatically add a new folder, a new subfolder called general. And if you have multiple libraries that you were already using in your team site, you're going to need to figure out how to align them with your new team. If your SharePoint folders don't align to your team's channels, you're going to need to think about how you may want to map them. And so what I usually tell people is the first thing you want to do is think about some initial channels. And channels, folders in SharePoint are about files, but in Teams, channels are also about organizing conversations. And I think we want to think about what are the conversation and file categories that we're going to be collaborating about for our team. And so sometimes that means organizing your team based on a work stream model, and other times you can look into your existing team site folders for clues about what might make sense in terms of organizing things in teams. The thing that's going to confuse everybody, or that I've noticed causes a lot of confusion, is the general folder. Now, I have to admit, I'm an information architect, and we don't like terms like general, miscellaneous, and other. We want everything to be neatly categorized in something that has meaning. And I get irritated when I see that general folder. So one of the things I want to do with my team is decide how are we going to use this general channel. We can't delete it. It's going to be there. And primarily, we want to use it for things that just don't fit our more organized and structured, topic-focused channel structure. So the other thing we want to remember is that folders in SharePoint can be sorted in a variety of ways in Teams. They are sorted alphabetically. We don't have a choice about that. So naming conventions for those channels are really important. And you're going to run into trouble if you're going to use numbers to organize your channels, you'll run into trouble if you do not use 2 digits. So I also try to make sure people know that you want to, I hope you're not going to use all 200 channels that you're allowed. Typically starting with a leading 0 is going to help you at least make sure that 01 sorts before 10. And so we do have to make sure that we've got sort of a naming structure for our channels, and then we have to decide what are we going to do with this general channel. So usually I try to save the general channel for general information. So for example, we might have an onboarding page helping to welcome people to the team. We also might use it to bring in some other sort of PMO kind of best practices for the team. It might be a good place if you were actively using SharePoint News on your team site. You can bring that into the general channel as well. But the most important thing to think about for that general channel is that the team needs to know the intent of not only that channel, but all of the channels. So another great thing to do with that general channel is bring in a page, whether you call it onboarding or not, that describes how are we going to be collaborating on our team. So use that channel, since you can't rename it, to do general kinds of things. And the most important thing actually is not that you not necessarily what you do with that channel, but that your team has an agreement for how you're going to use it. This is effectively a team compact or a service level agreement that you have with your team. And it's something that actually every team should have, whether you're using Microsoft Teams or not. It helps your team decide how are we organizing our files, how are we going to hold each other accountable. And it's always interesting to me that teams typically have a charter, what are we going to do, but very rarely take the time to write down how are we going to work together, not just what are we going to do. It's even more important when you're making this transition from SharePoint to Microsoft Teams. This is a great time when you're effectively up-leveling your SharePoint team site to clean up what you aren't using. So many times I see just tons of unused content in both intranet sites and team collaboration sites. So the first thing you might want to do before you Teamify or even talk about introducing Teams to your team sites is what can we clean up? Are there any sort of topics represented in your folder structure that might be good candidates for channels? Can we delete any content? Is there something that we don't need? One thing to think about is if we do have a folder for each team meeting, could we create a channel called meetings and then maybe use a subfolder within that for each meeting date to host the assets associated with your meeting? So again, this is all kinds of things you want to think about ideally before we introduce Teams. And while we're there, we want to think about, now that we've sort of structured the destination, how are we going to map existing content into our proposed channels? Make sure that all the folders in your document library are mapped to a channel. And if they aren't going to map to a channel, you're going to need to figure out, what do we want to do with that content? Ideally, everything should map into a channel. If not, maybe you want to move that content to a different document library and add it to the general channel or other channels if you possibly can. I'm going to see if I can take a little break and just check in the chat. Anything that I need to focus on?
The community is great. They answer already the questions which came up.
Good. All right. So just let me know if anything makes sense, if I need to address anything specifically. Getting people to clean up their SharePoint sites is like pulling teeth. Yes, as someone married to a dentist, I would say no, pulling teeth is probably easier than getting people to clean up your SharePoint files. But it's still really important. It's almost like you have to pry content out of people's cold, dead hands. The easiest way, I think, to get people to do it is if you're in an organization that has any kind of e-discovery, because if you don't delete files that should have been deleted based on your retention policies, it's just going to cost you a lot of money when the lawyers have to discover them. It can be more work, less work, to recreate content than to try and figure out where it was and whether it's useful in historical content. Now, as I tell my children, just because something's old doesn't mean it's not valuable. But there are potentially versions of files that you no longer need, or documents that were created on a temporary basis that probably don't need to be migrated or adapted to your new Teams environment. Okay, so now that we've looked at sort of what we want to think about in terms of structuring before we're going to Teams, if we could have done that when we launched it, I want to talk a little bit about sort of how we're going to get there. One thing I do want, one little tip I just want to add is that if you are using, particularly if you're using metadata on your SharePoint files, use the SharePoint app to add your the SharePoint library app, not to add your files, the SharePoint app. This is the app that is going to preserve all of your views and access to edit your metadata. Don't use the document library app. That is not going to bring in all the metadata and views from your source document library. I don't know why each of these things behaves differently, but use the SharePoint app in Teams when you're trying to bring in content from your legacy SharePoint site. Okay. All right, so let's talk about the different ways that we could be doing this. So if you're already in the cloud with modern Teams sites, the answer, of course, is to Teamify your existing sites. And this is actually relatively easy. It can happen in one of two ways, but it has to be done by the site owner. I hope that this is how most of us launched Teams if we were already using modern Teams sites. So you're prompted either using the little next steps icon, this little megaphone thing, or if it's the first time you've seen it, you may see it in the lower left-hand corner of your screen where it says basically add real-time chat. What that really means is make this into a team. Of course, before you promote this widely, you want to encourage your team site owners to stop and do a little planning first. So here's what happens when you do Teamify. Everything is wizard based, and unfortunately it's going to ask people to make decisions that they probably won't know how to make if they haven't done the planning step first. So one of the things I encourage people to do is if you are using your SharePoint site homepage, bring that into probably the general channel. Each list should be added as a tab. You can start with putting them in general, but I think in general, and what you're going to end up wanting to do is align the list with the topic of your Teams channels. Ignore style, library, and site assets. I really wish that you weren't prompted for those folders, and look at the other libraries and say, possibly planning, yes. Let's say you're in the cloud with classic team sites. Well, the first thing you're going to have to do here is you're going to have to look and see if you have subsites. If you do, you can still connect the top level site, but working with Microsoft Teams is not going to be as effective until you flatten your architecture. And so to get to a modern site, you don't have to be flat, but that's the best place to be. And so in order to get to Teams, if you've got classic sites, you first have to associate your site to a Microsoft 365 group. In other words, you have to groupify before you can Teamify. And there's some great documentation from Microsoft on exactly what happens and how to do that. But before you even get there, I would take a look at things to make sure that if you can possibly make a subsite, promote it to be a top level site, or eliminate your subsites as much as possible, you'll have a much better experience for people using Teams. And then finally, if you're on-prem, then I would say the first thing you really want to do is flatten, take a look at what you really need. What I've noticed about environments that are on-prem is that it isn't just content that isn't necessary anymore. It's sites that are completely unnecessary. I've been noticing this a lot in some clients that are still on-prem, that oftentimes people thought that in order to create a new page, you had to create a subsite. And there are just lots and lots of one-page subsites. Obviously, you could have created a new page in your classic environment. It's just that was something I think people just didn't know how to do. So before you look at what you're going to do as you're migrating, this is if you're going to the cloud, it's likely that everything is going to the cloud. And this is a really good opportunity to take a look at those one-page sites so you can eliminate them, delete as much content even before you do your analysis, so that you can try to, again, flatten out your architecture before you take your classic site and then bring it to a modern Teams site. And you're going to want to use a migration tool to help you do that so that you can preserve the dates and user IDs as you're doing the migration. And you can use the built-in tools from Microsoft, or you can use third-party tools as well. What I don't like is if you drag content, or if you try to sort of drag content on-prem into the cloud, that is going to get the name of the date and the name of the user associated with those files is going to be whoever did the upload or drag. And if you do want to preserve any dates and names, you're going to want to use a migration tool. Okay, so now if you've got everything set up, we want to think about what teams we need. We've created the team, and now you can sort of do your thing. Create the channels that you need in Teams. These will get you those SharePoint Teamified folders. And then think about what we're going to do with the content that doesn't map to a team. And again, this is all really part of planning. A few other things that I want to think about when I'm setting up a team is sort of what goes in that general channel. I mentioned this a little before. And again, Teams is now managing the folders that are in the default document library. So we want to start teaching people, if you're going to rename something, do it from Teams, and then it will flow through finally to SharePoint. And this, by the way, this capability has been delayed and delayed. It is rolling out as we speak, and it may not be available yet in any tenant, in your tenants, but watch for it to come soon. So the other thing I really spend a lot of time with new users of Teams is helping people make this decision about, do I need a new team or do I need a channel in a new team? And as with most things, I think it's really good to give people scenarios. So because these are not black and white decisions, unfortunately, and I think it's important to sort of think through what we're trying to do. So again, private channels in Teams create focused spaces for collaboration. Only the users on the team can be part of a private channel. And we're really trying to decide, do I need a new team? Do I need a new channel? Do I need a new private channel? And these are the scenarios in which I typically talk to people. So let's talk a little bit about private channels. So private channels, I think, can be very confusing for both Teams users and SharePoint users. But again, usually when you're creating a private channel, I think the most common scenario I've seen is that we have a team, we're collaborating with everyone on the team, but maybe there's a topic that we only want the team leadership to talk about, budgeting, finance decisions. So we make a private channel for just team leadership so that that is a place where we can talk about things and share files that are not accessible to the rest of the team. So it's a subgroup within a team. It can include guest members of the team. It can include people who are already on the team. But the important thing is that it's for private collaboration. You can have up to 30 private channels per team. And again, I think you want to keep this to a bare minimum, because if we start thinking about what goes where and where should I put things, and more importantly, where do things live, the fewer number of spaces in which to organize that content, the easier it will be for people to manage. Site permissions for that private channel, even though you do get a SharePoint site, are managed from a Teams perspective. And one other thing to note is that there are no channel meetings in private channels. So in terms of e-discovery works within private channels as well. Didn't used to cover private channel chat, and it does now. Okay, so shared channels, the preview, the opportunity to have a preview is rolling out now. And again, I think the most common use case for this will be to make it so that you do not have to tenant switch when you're sharing with an external organization. This is going to be beneficial to people like me who work with a lot of different clients. I think in most organizations, this will be more beneficial to consistently share content with another team that isn't part of your team. And effectively what happens is that shared channel, when you create a shared channel in your tenant or in your team, the team owner that you invite gets to decide in which team does this new channel appear. So it allows that team owner to place that shared space inside any team that they are the owner of. How many members will a shared channel support? I think the answer is whatever the membership is of a regular channel, but don't quote me on that. And there is some data that Microsoft has published about numbers associated with shared channels. I just don't have it at the top of my head, but I can look for that and put it in the chat. All right, so the other thing that is obviously one of the best features about Teams is the ability to have a meeting. And this is one of the most confusing things to explain to people once they are now working in Teams and now they're moving their SharePoint files to Teams. The other kind of confusing thing I think for people is, what kind of meeting do I need? And wait, I was already creating meetings. Now that you just sort of moved my SharePoint content into a team, do I need to do something differently from what I was already doing? Okay, so 2 types of meetings, standard meetings and channel meetings. And what's important about channel meetings is that they're inclusive. Effectively, when you create a channel meeting, they're visible and joinable by anyone who has access to the channel. You can, however, make certain people required for the channel meeting, even if they, if you want to make sure that that meeting invitation gets to their Outlook inbox. Channel meetings by default are not going to invite people However, someone, depending on how you set it up, you can make it so that anyone in your team can accept or effectively add the meeting to their personal calendar and then accept the meeting. So channel meetings are really good because they allow you to create this experience where anyone can join. The disadvantage to a channel meeting is that unless you're an external user, you are not automatically going to get invited to that meeting. So where we're using channel meetings quite effectively is for training that anybody can go to. So I just did a ton of testing with a team that wanted to really understand this concept of a channel meeting. In their team, they have a channel called training, and the training team is creating channel meetings for all training opportunities and allowing the setting when they create those meetings so that people can add it to their personal calendar and essentially accept the meeting invitation, which gets it, even though they're not going to get an email about it, if they see it in the channel, they can add it. What that allows you to do is if you've accepted the meeting in your calendar, the meeting organizer can actually see who's attended. If you don't accept the meeting organizer has no idea who attended the meeting. And so this allows you to get this sort of balance between inviting the entire team to every meeting, but also knowing who came and who attended. So channel meetings absolutely have a place. One of the biggest advantages, I think, of channel meetings is that when you record a channel meeting, the recording is automatically stored inside the channel, not in a person's, the person who presses the recording, not in their OneDrive. And so that makes it much easier to sort of find the recording later on. If you do explicitly want people to be invited, you can add their names as required, and then it will come to them in email. Both types of meetings, channel meetings and standard meetings, can be recurring, but a standard meeting is just like what you're used to. Only invited members participate, and they do receive invitations. You can schedule them from Outlook or Teams. Channel meetings have to be scheduled from within Teams. Everybody can look at the recordings, and this is the challenge with a standard meeting. The recording is stored in the OneDrive of the person who starts the recording, and so at some point you're going to want to move that recording. You will likely want to move that recording to the entire team if you really want, if you want the team to be able to see it. Otherwise, you can just leave it, and all the meeting attendees will get a link. If you're however, external users are not, are going to have to be explicitly added to the shared recording, which again makes it just a little more complicated, doable, but more complicated. And if the meeting really wasn't private, if you do want to share the recording to everybody, you can actually move the recording to the team where it will inherit the permission properties of whatever channel you store it in. The important thing about a standard meeting is that no one knows about it. They won't show up on your channel calendar. And by the way, that channel calendar is effectively a view of the team calendar filtered by which channel is hosting the meeting. Here's a little tip. If you want to see all the channel meetings that are going on for your team, that's actually easiest to do in SharePoint by adding the group calendar for the team to any of the pages in SharePoint, its own page or the home page. And what that will do is that group calendar will show you every upcoming meeting for the team, no matter what channel they're in. There's a question, there's a gap in functionality from the normal to channel meetings. Is that gap closed? I don't know what specific gap you're talking about. So if you can be more specific, that would be great. Okay, so a couple of other things you want to think about when you're helping users with this transition. One is, I think, helping people understand start in Teams will bring SharePoint to you. So this is if people are used to working in SharePoint, one of the things you can do to sort of give them that comfort zone in Teams is make the home page a tab in the general channel so that that familiar SharePoint interface will come to you inside Teams. pros and cons. The SharePoint site nav is not displayed to you when you bring a page into Teams. So what you'll want to think about is if there's anything important in the navigation, make sure it is added as an on-page link inside that SharePoint homepage. You may not need it as much anymore because, again, your organizational framework is the channel. But if you do, the way to get around that is to add the links directly to the homepage on your SharePoint site. Another way you can help people with the transition is that if I am in a SharePoint site that has a connected Teams, the site's going to tell you that. And so the other thing you'll know is that you can go from channel connected folders in SharePoint can help you get back to Teams. And one of the things I always do, if I'm on the SharePoint site looking at it in the browser, I always add a link in the quick launch to take me back to the team as well, so that it's both there's a visual cue in the team name because it's got the little Teams icon, but I also make sure in the nav I add the link to Teams, and it's an out-of-the-box link, so all you have to do is edit the nav and add the link to Teams to make it, again, easier to get back and forth. And then if you are in the Files tab in Teams, you may want to remind people that the Files tab in Teams helps you get into SharePoint. So we can come back and forth no matter what we're used to from any perspective. File metadata is kind of the most confusing thing. Although it is visible in Teams natively in the Files tab, it shows it to you, but it doesn't let you edit it. And that's why I always tell people, if you want to be able to edit your metadata in Teams, you need to add the document library directly using the SharePoint app. This one does not make a lot of sense to me, but it's the only way to get the SharePoint metadata to make, and all the views that you've created in that library to make it available to you in Teams. And there's a question, is there a way to open the SharePoint home site by default when someone clicks on the team instead of posts? Right now, you're going to see posts and files and you can't change the order. I am not sure that that will be a forever thing, but it is a for now thing. And again, you want to add the document library. What I've found is that we've had to create, we end up with two files tabs. One is the native Teams one, and the other one is the exact same thing, but where the metadata is visible. All right, so the other thing you want to make sure as you're sort of helping people transition is understand where files are landing when you're attaching a file in chat. So if you're in a one-to-one chat, the file that you've attached is going to be in your personal OneDrive, and the person on the chat message will have access to it. If you attach a file in a group chat, it is also going to be in your OneDrive. If you are working on your team and you're uploading or attaching a file in a chat, it will get stored in the team channel where you're having that conversation. So when you're having conversations related to the team, you want to do them in Teams. And so depending on how things were rolled out in your organization, this may be a transition as well. I have a lot of organizations rolled out Teams without even explaining the concept of creating a team. They were just using it for Teams, and now they've got a lot of group chats going with people who will now be effectively part of the team. And so we need to encourage them to transition those group chats to now having them as channel chats inside the team. I'm not saying this is easy. But again, it's a phenomenon that we are dealing with because of what's happened over the last couple of years. One important thing that I always want to teach people about is the magical power of OneDrive, because OneDrive, and I forget this a lot as well, is the best place to view all the files to which you have access in one place. And I don't mean the OneDrive that you sync. I mean the OneDrive online. The OneDrive app in Microsoft 365 is magical. It shows you all files, no matter where they're stored, that you have access to. And I think this is really important to sort of remind people that if you are in OneDrive and you search, you're just searching within files. So it can be the best way to remember, where is something? Where did I put it? How can I get back to it? So OneDrive is magical. Now, the second image on the bottom is a new view of OneDrive that's rolling out mid-March to late April. All right, so just a
One
few,
question.
sure, yeah.
There's a question about the meta tags of the doc
I don't
types.
get
Can you explain it again?
Okay. So the issue with metadata is that when you are looking, if a file has been created in SharePoint and you're organizing it with metadata, the Files tab in Teams, didn't used to, but it does now, shows you the metadata that's been assigned. But there is no way to edit the metadata from within Microsoft Teams because the little eye that allows you to see the properties and the feature that allows you to edit that metadata is not visible in the Files tab. If you, however, add the SharePoint, that document library using the SharePoint app, you'll get the SharePoint interface for that library. So the metadata is now editable directly from within Teams. Again, not so much an issue if you're not using metadata. And Teams first organizations are not as metadata happy as SharePoint first organizations. They're probably organizing their content with folders because that's basically all that's visible directly in Microsoft Teams. It's these SharePoint first organizations that have the biggest challenge because they got used to metadata, organizing their content with metadata, and all of a sudden Teams is introducing the F word that they were folders, which they were told were really bad. Okay. How can you insert the metadata version number of the document in the Word document? That's a question I actually don't have an answer to. Maybe the community can answer that one. We used to be able to do it with document properties. I don't know if it's super easy to do in SharePoint Online. All right, so again, some educational tips. One thing I actually really dislike about Teams is I hate the wiki tab. I typically delete the wiki tab in all channels, and if we're using OneNote on the team, I will add the direct link to the OneNote app, the OneNote notebook that is actually stored in the Site Assets library of Teams. And again, all of these things can't really work very well if the team doesn't get together to talk about how we want to work together. So down with the wiki. I love OneNote. I couldn't live without OneNote. So meet with your team to discuss your collaboration contract, how you're going to get going. All right, just to sort of wrap things up, how do we get started? Identify your team sites in SharePoint that don't have a connected team. If there's a team already, this is the challenge. So maybe all of this got rolled out already, and you have some teams for teams, and you have SharePoint sites for teams. If you have team sites in SharePoint that don't have a connected team, you now want to take a look and say, hey, is there a team that got created whenever it got created that already exists? And I think what you're going to want to do is move those legacy files from that SharePoint site to the new one so that you can delete the legacy site so that there is, again, only one place to go. If you've got classic sites that need to be teamified, before you do that, do some planning. And if they are classic sites, you're going to groupify, then teamify. And if you're on-prem, you want to plan, if you can, plan your Microsoft Teams launch before you do it, clean up the legacy content, flatten out your architecture, and then do the migration. And as you're doing this, the best thing that we can do is help our users understand the connections and the relationships. And once you do that, you can basically now live in Microsoft Teams. And I look at Teams is really, for me, it's become my new desktop. Everything I need is actually in Microsoft Teams, including the intranet once you've deployed Viva Connections. But until you help people make this transition, if they're a SharePoint first organization, it's just going to be more confusing. So I think this is a good time to take a step back, think about what we want to do, what we can clean up, and let's use 2022 to kind of clean up our house so that our Teams and SharePoint content can live together peacefully. There are no documents in Teams. We're going to need SharePoint, but it's not an either or. It's really a both and. And that is how I will leave you. So here's all the different ways that you can reach out and contact me. The slides from this session, if you want them, are already uploaded in the Teams Nation files section. And please rate my session and give me some feedback. And I really appreciate everyone sort of answering the questions. I'm going to go back and look through them now. If you want to just call out anything I really need to address, I will do that. But thanks very much for attending, and I'll stick around if you have more questions.